It's Lee Come Key.
Welcome back to the Lee Come Key request line. Ready for something with a kick that's still smooth? Talk about a hot time at dinner time.
Crisscross.
This is America's #1 spicy mayo and non-GMO verified sriracha. It's the Sriracha Slide coming at you from Lee Come Key.
Turn it out.
Sriracha Slide on over to srirachalove.com to check it out.
Sriracha real smooth.
The investigation of Israel Keys continues. It's part of an active and ongoing investigation by the FBI. If you have any information that can help, reach out to your local FBI field office or visit tips.fbi.gov. The following may not be suitable for all audiences.
The problem is nowadays, the more stuff my name is attached to, the more likely it is that somebody's going to try to do some kind of stupid freaking TV special, or you know how it is nowadays, like with all this true crime bullshit that people are obsessed with, and that's, yeah, I am concerned about that, about someone connecting the dots on this, and I don't know how, like I know there's certain privacy laws, but I know that, you know, for the most case, they're not going to apply to me, and so I know that at some point, it's pretty likely that if someone tried hard enough, they could, you know. So, I mean, if I'm dead, then the investigation from the federal government's point of view is pretty much closed.
This happened in 2012 and it's 2024 and we're still here in Anchorage. We are still working this case.
We're all wired differently. Some of us are wired for good. Some of us are wired for bad. But a select few step outside all of society's boundaries. From cold open media, this is Deviant. Israel Keys, off script.
Hey everybody, this is Dan Szematowicz.
And this is Andrew Iden.
And welcome to Deviant, off script, Israel Keys. If you aren't already, make sure you're following this show wherever you're listening to the podcast. Follow us on social too, and you can interact with us there. Instagram, TikTok, at deviant.podcast. And of course, check out our Patreon. There's all sorts of great stuff there, behind the scenes material, audio, video, access to chatting with Andrew and I and the team on Discord. It's also a place you can ask questions, leave comments, in addition to all the other places. Deviantpodcast.com for our Patreon.
And you've probably noticed by now our format's a little different. We're not doing kind of the storytelling version of what you're used to. The off-script episode, we're going to do this at the end of each series, each story that we tackle. And the idea being we kind of give you a little bit more outside of the normal form. So what we're going to do today is we're going to walk you through a couple different things. We're going to play you some tape that we didn't get a chance to fit into the show because, frankly, the Israel Keys story is incredibly dense and it's incredibly long.
There's so much, yeah.
So we're going to play some tape that you haven't heard. You're going to hear some things that may be new to you. We're also going to answer some questions from you guys, the listeners, that we've gotten from various corners of the internet, YouTube, Spotify, etc. And then the other thing we're going to do is at the very end, we're going to actually pull back the curtain a little bit, and we're going to show you and play for you some sound from our next series, which we are currently in production on. So we're going to kind of take you through some of the nuts and bolts of that. And, we're off and running.
It's a stacked agenda, so let's get going.
So with that said, we also wanted to make sure in this episode we got to a little bit of sound that folks maybe didn't hear that we weren't able to include in the show. And one of the things for me with Keys that's so fascinating is beyond the crimes that he committed is kind of the formidable years and the youth and the adolescence and kind of growing up, right? That is really interesting to me. And some of the people that knew him, as he became an adult and was kind of navigating this world he had built for himself. And, you'll remember back in, and I can't even remember what episode it is at this point, but Jim Thompson.
No, 5.
Was 2? 5?
5.
Well, I assume if you've gotten this far, you know who we're talking about. We're talking about
2. It was a 2 at one point, and it turned into 5.
Okay, so Jim Thompson was a fascinating conversation, and he talked to us about a lot of things, but he talked about being an employee at the Nia Bay Parks and Recreation Department. with Israel Keys. And I hope it came through in the episode. This is a guy that spent hours riding in a truck, riding shotgun with Israel Keys, right? If you've ever had one of those jobs where you're in close quarters with someone for long periods of time, this was Jim Thompson and Israel Keys, right? They spent a lot of time together. And so he's done a lot of reflecting and thinking about those years and what he may or may not have missed, what could have happened. But I just wanted to play a little bit of sound from that interview. So give this a listen.
Looking back on our time together, it's like, what if? There's 60 miles between Port Angeles and Nia Bay, and there were plenty of times where we'd come here to Port Angeles and drive around Lake Crescent, where he said he's dumped bodies before. Looking back at that, it really stuck with me for a while. I felt like, how did I dodge that bullet? How was I not another victim?
So what's interesting about that sound is that obviously, and I don't know if Jim didn't necessarily say that he and Keys were friends, right? But they spent a lot of time together. And so what's interesting is to hear that and him talking about the possibility of being a victim.
You know what's also interesting? Just to jump in real quick,
Sure.
He mentions that it's 60 miles between Port Angeles and Nia Bay. So he was rolling back and forth between Port Angeles in Washington and Nia Bay all the time. And just a reminder, Jeff Bell, the former Anchorage police detective that we heard a lot from in the show, he believes that there is a cache of souvenirs of Israel's victims that Keys buried somewhere in Port Angeles. And right now, Jim Thompson is also a cop in Port Angeles. So some interesting Port Angeles connections that sort of spider out over time as well.
Yeah, so if that cache is ever found, Israel Keys somehow returns to Jim Thompson's life in some capacity. It's kind of eerie. Man. But to hear him talk about possibly being a victim, it's interesting because what I want to do is I want to play a little bit of sound from Israel Keys, who talks about the idea of picking his victims and how he chooses and the psychology behind initiating conversation and whether or not that has any bearing on whether he's going to choose to commit some sort of a murder or something to people that he initiates conversation with. It's interesting. Give this a listen.
Rolling.
Did you ever get in a position where you started a conversation with someone that you had thought about doing something, and then they, for whatever reason, you got a vibe from them that it wouldn't be a good idea? Or are you able to make a decision as soon as you see it, see the person?
No, it always has to be, I don't know, as soon as someone talks to me and sees me, then that kind of puts it on a different spectrum for me. You have to take somebody by surprise. I don't know why. It's like when I start talking to people, then I go into a different mode, like I want to be their friend or something. But obviously, if I have already decided to take somebody, then I'm not their friend.
But you don't give them that chance either. It's not like you have a casual conversation and then overtake them or something. Do you do that so that there isn't anything personal up front?
I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it. It's just...
I think we already talked about this, but you were never questioned by law enforcement about why you were ever at any of these places or anything?
Well, like I say, casually.
By law enforcement?
Yeah.
Like they would see you at a trailhead and just small talk with you?
Right, yeah.
Are you here to fish? Are you here to hike? Those kind of things.
Right.
Let me see your fishing license.
Right, and I usually had...
Everything?
Yeah, I always had all that stuff. Honestly, a lot of times that's what I was doing. Far back, because I can remember it. That's where I get a lot of the ideas. Either fishing or out hunting.
Thinking of them.
Yeah, stalking through the woods and see somebody in the woods. They don't see you. You sit there and watch them for a while. And I can remember doing that from the time I was like 13 or 14 years old.
Thinking you could, or just the fact that you're able to watch them and they don't know you're watching them.
Right. That was always the most comfortable scenario for me because it's a win-win situation. I'm out hunting or fishing, and if the opportunity comes up, then you take it. If it doesn't, it's not like you're out anything.
So what I found interesting about that sound is that Keys talks about in order for him to do something to someone, he has to initiate the contact. And it's kind of a glimpse into the psychology of this in that as soon as someone walks up to him and says, hey, or initiates any kind of dialogue at all, it's almost like a disarming effect. He doesn't necessarily have that switch that enabled him to do such horrible things, that switch isn't going to get flipped on if someone speaks to him first. He has to initiate the conversation.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how many times someone's life was saved just by, being polite, right?
Right.
It's crazy. Just listening to that, it really makes me think about how self-aware he was. We've touched on this theme before, right? But, he was very studious. And you find this in a lot of serial killers, serial sexual offenders, that they really do study other serial killers. They study the craft for different reasons. And Keyes actually talked extensively about this on tape. And we have two pieces of tape to play here. They're both fascinating, and they're a little longer, but they're so fascinating. Then the first one, he talks about sort of how he studied, right? And who he most identifies with in the serial killer world. So let's take a listen to that.
You read about a lot of other serial killers and reading about other crimes and that kind of stuff. Might be a weird question, but who's your favorite? We've talked about it, so we're kind of curious, and we're curious on who your favorite is.
Well, my favorite ones haven't been caught yet, so.
That's
a fair question.
That's actually a good response. Okay, of the ones who have been caught that you've been able to read about, we'll see who was right or who was closest for us.
Favorite, if what I've read about them is accurate, I don't feel that close to any of them. So I guess I identify most, or my favorite, if you have to put it that way, would be the ones that I identify most with.
Yeah,
so
that's a fair way to say it.
Just going off of what I've read, Ted Bundy maybe. I don't have a lot of respect for some of them because of the way they lived, I guess.
I mean, did you start reading about them because you were curious about you, or was it a study guide, so to speak? I mean, that'd be a weird question too. Did you learn things?
Well, the first book I read, I think it was called Mindhunter, and it was written by an FBI profiler.
John Douglas, right?
Yeah. I read that years and years ago, probably when I was 15 or 16 maybe. I was, somewhat disturbed by it just because, I don't know, it's always been that way. It's always felt like I was kind of reading about myself in a lot of those books. Not the myself that everybody knew, but,
Mm-hmm.
Did that worry you, concern you, make you think it was...
Well, at first, like I say, at first I was pretty conflicted about it, but that was all just because of the way I'd been raised and stuff. And, I grew up with good people. I was never, everybody's always nice to each other and everything's all sunshine and roses. So that's why it was disturbing to me, because it seemed like for a long time I either thought everybody else was faking it and everybody was like me, they just didn't act like it. Or I figured that I was a demon child or whatever, I don't know. But, all that went away when I was in my 20s. I didn't feel bad about it anymore. You
didn't feel bad that you had those thoughts?
I knew that most people didn't think the way I did by then. I just didn't feel bad about thinking differently.
So you said Ted Bundy, you kind of felt like maybe you had some things or at least in common with or something. Do you know stuff about him? You studied?
I know that he was very sexually motivated in the stuff that he did. And I know that in the last few years he had a really hard time controlling himself and separating his two lives, if you want to call it that. And I also identified with him because it seemed like he was able to separate his two different aspects, or whatever you want to call his personality.
Anything specific about his crimes?
No, honestly, I like I said, I never really, from what I've read anyway, I never felt that close to any of them. I just saw similarities in all of them.
Yeah, that's a really key point. He saw similarities to himself in all these serial killers, and he liked some more than others. And in the tape we're about to hear, you'll hear who he really liked, and one particular very famous serial killer that he really did not like. So let's give that a quick listen.
I was more interested in the real life thing.
The real, like, books about specific people, like BTK.
Right,
But
case studies.
On BTK, was that one of them, or not so much?
He wasn't one of my favorites. No.
Green River.
We've already established.
He was interesting. I know all of them.
You know all
even the ones. I was more interested in the older stories, like turn of the century.
Okay, like going way, but like Jack the Ripper, that far back.
Well, Jack the Ripper's not that interesting because they never caught him. But yeah, there's just different everybody thought of it as a new phenomenon back then. That's what made it.
What it was.
Genocide was becoming unpopular, so serial killers had to find something else to do.
What was the most interesting ones that you read about?
Holmes.
Tell me about Holmes.
Holmes was, I think, turn of the century, 1900.
Where?
He had a castle dungeon combination in, I think it was Chicago. He would give free room and board to people who were coming to the World Fair there. Anyway, essentially, he had his house designed as a body processing factory. He would invite people to stay in this nice castle in these rooms, and had gas plumbed into the rooms and greased chutes down to the basement, sell their skeletons to drugstores and medical hospitals and stuff. He was interesting because he was a pretty sane individual. He looked at it as more of a business enterprise kind of thing, even though probably unquestionably he was doing it for more than that. But
why didn't you like BTK?
He was a hack.
A number of years he seemed to get away with
it. He got away with it for a long time. That was the most disappointing thing about him, is that he never had to get caught. He just got bored, so he was too soft in his old age to actually go out and do anything again, so he decided to go the publicity route without actually doing anything. He was also pretty unusual in that he was able to stop.
Yeah, for a number of years.
Plus, I saw the live prison interview, and my impression of him, his personality, is that he was actually sorry for the things that he had done younger, kind of like repented or thought he was repenting of his ways kind of thing. And
I think that was for real, or was that a show?
I think it was for real. I don't think if he really didn't believe that he was repenting of his sins, I don't think he ever would have stopped. Because he stopped for like 20 years. I don't know, in my mind that's impossible, but I'm just saying BTK, for example, he must have found a really interesting hobby to have for those 20 years.
Nobody knows what happened during those 20 years.
He was a publicity hog, so I think if he had done something, he probably would have told people about it. Like Green River, he was probably the most prolific, certainly in modern times. But it seems like he might have been another one who the last few years he wasn't doing anything. I know he was already married and settled down, but I think he had been married for part of the time. I was always interested in those individuals that had to lead that life. It's not easy.
That's kind of what you were doing.
Right, and that's why I can say, like, from my perspective, I know it's not easy.
It's interesting to listen to that because, you know, he sounds sort of professorial about his knowledge of this. And there's a lot of times throughout the tape where he's kind of got this sort of kind of pompous, arrogant posture. And when he talks about those, it's almost like...
It's almost like you and I, when we talk about baseball, right? Like we know it backwards and forwards.
Right. Yeah, I mean, clearly the guy has done his homework, which makes it even more terrifying. But just kind of the way he talks about, H.H. Holmes, I know all about him. Or, well, BTK should have done it this way. And it's like, man, it's impossible to try to understand sometimes a guy that's kind of steeped in that and has that understanding.
Yeah, and like the way he talks about BTK, you know, that he doesn't like him because he gave up, because he stopped, because he showed remorse. To me, that's a very interesting window into Keyes' psyche. Like, you know, to his mind, this is stuff that these actions, these serial killings, these are things that you should celebrate, right? These are things that you should be proud of. You don't apologize for them. You never apologize for them. This is yours. They're yours. Like that seems to be what I'm hearing when he says these things. And it's interesting to hear another serial killer say BTK was a punk, basically, right?
Yeah. Some of the tape that I wanted to dive into, you know, I mentioned earlier about his upbringing and really being an interesting part of this story for me. You know, I remember, Dan, we were talking about this particular piece of tape during our process, and it struck me because Israel Keyes, I think, had some issues with his father. And I'm not a psychologist. This is just from...
safe to say, I think, yeah.
Yeah. So had some issues with his dad, and I think that probably some of those issues stemmed from religion, kind of the way that they hopped from community to community. And I think by the time he got to a certain age, I don't think he said, he had really rejected religion, right? And so part of that rejection manifested itself later when he started talking about churches and how one of the things he really wanted to do was burn a church. So I want you to hear this piece of tape and we'll talk about it on the other side.
I was looking for a church to burn. That's what I really wanted to do. And then when I was in Texas, I was looking at a lot of churches too.
Why is that?
Oh, just it's like a personal thing. I had it in my mind that I was going to start using churches.
What was your plan with churches? I mean, what was in your mind?
Well, if it's an out-of-the-way church, there's usually nobody there on the weekdays. So
use them for what, though? I mean, you said using churches.
Well, for an example, that's what I was looking for in Vermont, was a church.
To take the couriers
to? Take someone to. I didn't. You said it was a personal thing. I have a lot of issues with organized religion. I'm sure it has something to do with the way I was raised, but for the most part, it's just my general outlook on life and humanity, I guess.
The reason that's telling to me is that the burning of the church, I feel like, is almost some sort of statement, right? It's a real life manifestation of his rejection of religion, and why and how that all started as a kid is fascinating to me. Of this really strict upbringing he was in, and speaking of that, we had a great conversation with Desiree and John Smith, who knew Israel Keyes when they were part of that Christian identity movement. It bears repeating that those two have since completely rejected and distanced themselves from the Christian identity movement, which is primarily built on tenets of white supremacy and anti-Semitism and all of these kind of hate-filled ideas that I think we all should and do reject. But they talked about when the Israel Keyes story came to bear and people realized who this was and the connection that people in that community were making to, that's a guy that used to be in our group. So I want you to hear John Smith talk about that. Here's that sound.
There were definitely people that were like, who would have ever seen this happen? And it's like, what? I mean, were you in the same room as I was? There were definitely those. There were definitely others. There was an older lady who would have been like a peer to Israel's mother. She was just aghast that anyone would even talk about these details because of the trauma that it would cause for the mother to even think about it. And I encouraged her to think about the mothers and the family members of the people that Israel had tortured and killed and what their lives must be like. And absolutely, we need to talk about this sort of thing because we've created a community that literally, at the very least, housed this guy for a while.
Yeah, so the detachment, even in that community, to the reality of what Keyes was and had done is shocking on a number of levels, but also when you kind of delve into that community and see what the ideology is, it's also not surprising. But I just found that to be a fascinating wrinkle to this entire thing.
Back in '96, Atlanta was booming with excitement around hosting the Centennial Olympic Games. And then, a deranged zealot willing to kill for a cause lit a fuse that would change my life and so many others forever, rippling out for generations. Listen to Flashpoint on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
A lot of people are associated with Israel Keyes. A lot of potential victims are associated with Israel Keyes. Some names are more strongly associated with him than others. And of course, as we were doing the story, we ran down those names. We're paying attention. We're doing the research. We're reading all the sources out there. And there are a couple names out there that really jumped out as far as people widely suspect that Israel Keyes could be connected. And the reason you're hearing it here in this loose ends show that we're doing in off script here is because we were not able to connect them to Keyes, but we did talk to the people who are trying to solve these cases. And let's just go over a couple of them.
Before we get to these names, I just want to highlight something that I learned in the course of working on this case. And that is there are hundreds of unsolved murders and
it's amazing.
Missing people. Like, I mean, we all know this, but until we kind of dove into the story and we were reading about, is the dot here connected to that? Like, I don't think we have any idea how many unsolved murders or unsolved disappearances just kind of exist on a daily basis. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, just in the United States, so many people go missing every day. Sometimes you'll get Amber Alerts, or you'll get some sort of a note on your phone or an email that alerts you to that. And that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg.
You know, before we get to these names, we should say these aren't names that were just picked out of thin air, right? We were clear in our work to make sure that these are names that have been mentioned in some capacity, in some connection to Israel Keys, be it the time frame, be it geography, whatever. We didn't just pick names out of thin air, because there has been a lot of that when it comes to Keys.
Yeah, some of these names are actually on Wikipedia, so we're a little busy, but if you feel like correcting the record, you know, that's what Wikipedia is for, right?
Right. Have you ever actually edited a Wikipedia page?
I haven't. Have you? You have, haven't you?
I did, just the other day for the first time in my life. It was a glaring omission. And I just
what was it?
It was a baseball player who had literally been traded 2 hours earlier, and his old team was listed as his current team. And I was like, I'm going to do something for the first time in my life. I'm going to correct a Wikipedia page.
It was 2 hours old. Was that really a glaring omission?
Well, I mean, it wasn't a glaring omission, but you know, it's like when a celebrity dies, right? There's like this race to be the first person to update the page. Anyway, but we have digressed. But so these names come with some form of a little bit of substantial backing of sorts, I guess, for lack of a better term, and their connection to this case. And the first name, if you want to go ahead and start,
let's do it.
The first name that we came across was Julie Harris. And Julie Harris was a 12-year-old girl who went missing in March of 1996. And her remains were actually found over a year later, in April of 97. And so one of the things that's interesting about this is in Colville, right? We talked about Colville back in episode 2, I believe it was.
Yeah.
This is a small community, right? This is not a large major city. There does not seem to be a high count of disappearances or homicides in a place like this that's this small. Israel Keys, we know, in 96 was in Colville. This is where he was living. And so obviously the thought becomes, okay, a girl goes missing. Her remains are found a year later. Yeah. It's also geographically in the same place where one of the most kind of meticulous, process-oriented serial killers we've ever seen is in sort of a formative period of his life, right? And so we made sure to go down that path. So we reached out to the Stevens County, Washington sheriff, which is in Colville. And we asked him, we said, look, was Keys looked at as someone who was connected to this case? And what he told us was Keys was looked at, but is not the primary suspect. And he also added that a lot of the Keys speculation is based on conspiracy theory. And I think, I don't know if conspiracy theory is the phrase I would necessarily use, but I think it's a lot of online conjecture,
his words,
chatter.
Right, yeah.
Well, yeah, his words, not mine. But there's been a lot of chatter about that story and that case because it was time, place, where Keys was in his life. And it should be noted, this was a name that was in all of those FBI documents that we looked through, right?
Yeah. And he was actually asked about Harris in those tapes. He just flat out denied it. He's like, oh, I remember hearing about that, but I had nothing to do with it.
When you were living in Colville, do you remember the case where Julie Harris, she was a double amputee, went missing?
96?
Yeah. She lived, I think, pretty close to you, and she went missing. And
I do remember hearing about that.
And
she was young, I think, like 11 or 12.
I remember the name. I don't remember the details of the story. I remember that it seems like it was a pretty big deal, local news and stuff, and I was working construction at the time, so I would hear stuff. But I never took a personal interest in it.
Okay.
Sounds like it was pretty big news, so just kind of didn't know if that had any impact.
That's probably why I remember it.
With Keys, always take that for what it's worth, but I think we'll hear a little later, like investigators have a sort of tell as to when he was or was not involved in something that they confronted him with. And at least at the time, my guess is that they seem to find it pretty credible that he was not involved. And clearly the sheriff in Washington, Brad Menke, believes that as well.
Keys has mentioned before in some of these interviews, he veered away from children. Children were not necessarily his victimology. That's what he says. Of course, what he really did, we still don't have a full understanding of. So if that is in fact true, perhaps there is some merit to the idea that this was not Keys.
Yeah. As long as we're in Colville, let's talk about Marlene and Cassie Emerson. Again, Colville, they lived in a trailer about 5 miles outside of town. On June 27th of 97, their trailer was set on fire. Marlene's body, Marlene was the mother, Cassie's the daughter, was found, and Cassie was gone. Marlene's body was found. Cassie's remains were found a month later. A couple things here. Now, Israel Keyes was living in the area. He was in the area at the time. We know he talked about burning things, especially trailers. And early on, actually, this is one that we were really interested in. Like, would this fit? This felt right. But same sheriff, Brad Banke, he told us that the Emerson case is actually nearing a prosecution. And then Keyes is not a suspect. Clearly, that's different language than, what he said about the Harris case, right?
Yeah, that kind of struck me that, with Julie Harris, he was kind of quick to say he's not the primary suspect. With Emerson, he was definitive that he is not a suspect. And I mean, look, you have to think about the way law enforcement talks about some of these things sometimes. Yeah. You can't just kind of apply what your direct logic would be, because they are very careful with the words that they use and the way that they deploy those, right?
Yep.
So this one, it doesn't seem that Keyes has a direct link here. But again, this one also was mentioned in those FBI documents. People had called and said, look, this is a very plausible possibility here. And then finally, there's the name Barbara Lee Tooley. That's a name that we saw in these documents that surfaced a few times. And the details of Tooley's, of the crime here are, she was killed during a 2009 home invasion in Glendale, Oregon. She was killed by gunshot. It should be noted, Israel Keyes said that Bill Currier was the only person he ever killed with a gun. Now, again, we all know serial killers lie. Whether he's telling the truth, we don't know. But the FBI documents that we read say one of the reasons why they ruled Keyes out is that home invasion is not part of his MO, right? But that was
we know that's not true.
Right, that's completely not true, considering how he did the blitz attack on the couriers in Essex, Vermont.
Yeah.
So there seemed to be some competing ideas there. We did reach out to the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. They're handling this investigation, and they told us no comment, plain and simple. So make of that what you will.
And the reason that Keyes was initially brought up in this is, again, because of time, location, where he was, and what he was doing at that time. And, there was every opportunity for him to be in Oregon, Glendale, Oregon on that day.
So those are the three names that really kind of jumped out at us, sifting through documents and reading all of the different people that have sort of been linked to Keyes at some point in some capacity.
There is another one we're going to get to later, but we'll get to that later.
Well, that's a tease. But Dan, I know that you spent a lot of time sifting through the whole Belize, Mexico travel angle of this case, right?
Yeah.
So can you kind of walk us through, because you know this better than I, can you walk us through how Belize and the Mexico travel kind of shapes?
So just to kind of give the overall context of this, right? The FBI knows that Israel Keyes had a lot of international travel. He was in the Army, of course, so there was all that travel, and we talked about that in the show. But there was some other international travel that we didn't talk about. He traveled extensively through Canada. We did reach out to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who would, investigate the kind of crimes that Israel Keyes could possibly have committed, and we got really no word there. But one thing that did jump out to us in these FBI documents was 2 trips, one to Belize and several to Mexico. Belize, let's start with Belize. So Keyes and his girlfriend at the time go there. He was still living in Colville, I believe, Neah Bay in Washington at the time. They'd go to Belize in October of 2005 and spend almost a month there. A man named Thomas Perez goes missing in that window. He never comes home. His wife reports him missing. The local cops can't find him or any sign of foul play, and they assume that he left his wife and returned to Mexico, where he was originally from, but there's no record of him crossing the border or anything. He's just gone, and he still is to this day. Okay, so why Keyes? Why could Keyes be connected? So Perez, even though he's from Mexico, he lived in a district of Belize near the Mexican border called Corozal. When Keyes committed suicide in December of 2012, we know he left a suicide note, but also he left painted on the wall of his jail cell in his own blood the word Coruscant. We don't know why. This just happened to jump out at us in the FBI documents for obvious reasons.
Do we know what Coruscant means?
What does it mean?
I'm asking you.
Oh, no. I just thought it was a place.
Well, but I mean, I'm wondering if there's some, look, like with everything about keys is like what there is on the surface. And then it's like, okay, is there something?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's easy to make the inference here that, he's saying that he was active in Coruscant, or Coruscant has some sort of special meaning for him, or he was leaving some kind of final hint. Maybe he's like, okay, I'll give you one more body. Here's your hint. It's Coruscant. That's very possible. There are ruins in Coruscant that, I believe they're Mayan, forgive me if I'm wrong about that, but they have some ancient spirituality and mystique to them. And I believe there's some affinity for him with that. But the FBI was interested in Thomas Perez going missing from Coruscant and Belize, and Keyes wrote Coruscant in blood in his jail cell. Is there a connection?
I did not have Mayan ruins on the Israel Keyes bingo card.
That bingo card is a weird one, man, including
the Mexico travel.
Yeah.
Walk us through that.
I will try. Okay, so just being upfront here, there's a lot we don't know about this, but there was a journal and writings recovered from Israel Keyes after he was arrested, in the search of his house in Alaska. We have not been able to see that journal in full. We've just been able to see excerpts or items from that journal in the FBI documents, stuff that they pulled out that he had noted. So he went to Mexico several times in 2006 and 2007. His journal for 5/12/2006, May 12th, 2006, travel to surgery in Mexico. May 13th, 06, surgery. May 14th, 06, hospital. We don't know what kind of surgery he was going to Mexico for. There's been lots of speculation out there. Then he goes back to Mexico more than a month later, June 21st to June 23rd. The journal entry says Mexico for surgery follow-up. And then in April of 2007, April 29th, 2007, the journal says Cosmed. Police figure out that is a cosmetic surgery place in Tijuana in Mexico. So he was going to Mexico for some random or mysterious surgery. If you're active out there on the internet about Keyes, you've seen some of the theories about what that could be. Anything from simple plastic surgery to something more nefarious to, make himself some kind of more efficient killer. We have no information that points one way or another. We just know that he was traveling to Mexico for unexplained surgeries.
So that's let's see, 2 travels to Mexico in just over a year, right? And then a potential third trip that pertains to this Cosmed reference in his journal in April of 2007.
Yeah.
Whether that was an appointment or an actual trip he made, we're not clear.
Maybe it's something as simple as maybe he needed some kind of surgical procedure, and it's much less expensive in Mexico than if you're uninsured or something like that. It could be something as innocent as that.
Right. He wouldn't be the first person to have done that.
No, but we just don't know. And that's been one of those mysterious threads that have really been out there over the years. So it's something we've definitely rolled around in our minds, but we don't have an answer either.
So I want to jump on to one thing you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
You mentioned Canada. And I wanted to make sure people do know. We did at least get a response from the Mounties, the RCMP. And I think it's important we mention. So Staff Sergeant Chris Clark, who is the senior media relations officer for the RCMP, said to us when we asked about investigating Keyes as it pertains to Canada, he said, the British Columbia RCMP regularly collaborates with our domestic and international policing partners, sharing intelligence to detect criminal activity. What I can tell you is the RCMP investigated the possible involvement of Israel Keyes with respect to our unsolved missing and murdered persons cases. However, there was no evidence to link him to any of those investigations. The RCMP cannot speak to any investigative actions that may have been taken in other jurisdictions within Canada or elsewhere. So they did investigate, they did look, but at this point, don't have anything to link him to those. Well, this is the thing, right? Israel Keyes eluded authorities for so long.
Yeah.
Of course, that's the accurate statement, but that doesn't mean that he's not, responsible for something in Canada. It's the riddle. It's the entire kit and caboodle here with Keyes. So it's a fascinating look at beyond the American borders. We mentioned in that first episode that the story was going to take you all over the place. And so this is really just kind of underscoring, geography was of no consequence to Israel Keys.
Yeah, so those are some of the big odds and ends that really jumped out to us, but there is a bunch that jumped out to you as well. And we asked you to let us know what your questions and comments were, and you sent us a bunch. And we picked out some that we're just going to get into. And we're going to start with questions from our Deviant Black members. And that's our premium tier of our Patreon, which you can check out by going to deviantpodcast.com. And again, there you can find all sorts of behind-the-scenes stuff, primary source material, documents, videos, audio, access to the Discord with me and Andrew, where we're there chatting. So come check it out. And our first question comes from Deviant Black member Lindsay Mentler.
Lindsay says, there's a Reddit post that talks about Lauren Spears' disappearance and claims the FBI have a cell phone ping from an Alaskan number within 2 square miles of where Lauren was last seen within the 40-minute window of when she most likely disappeared. There was also an Alaskan phone number pinged near the Courier murders. Can you ask FBI if this is true or not?
Well, you're in luck, Lindsay Mentler. Thank you for the question, and thank you for being a Deviant Black member. We actually did talk to the FBI and Detective Jeff Bell about Lauren, and here is what they had to say about that.
We were able to rule him out of that. We did look at that case very closely, and we feel pretty confident that he was not responsible for Lauren's disappearance.
Interesting. People like to cross-reference his known travels with murders that happened. And it's interesting that it seemed like Spurrier, for example, like he was driving through the area at the time. He was driving through Indiana. It just seems crazy. Like that's not the only coincidence where he has passed through and a body has shown up, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you give us some sort of statistical context as to how that may be possible, right? Because it seems like a huge coincidence.
I don't know what to attribute it to. We had several homicides, and you've probably watched many of these interviews, but several homicides where or victims in particular, that missing persons that we would present to Keys and just to see if we could get a reaction out of him. And Lauren was one of those. But his reaction was essentially, Lauren was a very attractive young woman, and he made a joke of kind of like, I wish I had, kind of a thing. I wish I had. So,
because at that point, what's the downside in confessing to him, right?
Exactly, because it was during that same conversation that we asked him about Deborah Feldman, and his response was basically, I don't want to talk about this now. I don't remember his exact words, but something to that effect.
It's a ways from the area. I mean, he was driving through northern Indiana, and she was taken from southern. I mean, not that it couldn't have happened, but it was. He was pretty definite no on when it was a no, but he was not a no on Deborah.
So. Hopefully that answers your question. It looks like Lauren Spear is a no to investigators.
And can I just add some of the context of the conversation? When we talked to Jolene Godin, her demeanor about it was kind of like, this is something we're asked often, and we can tell you with some certainty. It felt pretty definitive when she talked about that.
Yeah. All right. From our free Patreon members, we have a question from Meg Hicks. If you could ask Keys one thing that he had to tell the truth about, what would your question be? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's...
if we will get to ask one?
Yeah, what's yours?
I think it has to be... I'll go for the headline one. How many people did you actually kill? I mean, that's the question we've been trying to answer throughout this entire series that we did on Israel Keys. What is the actual, true, real number of people that you killed? If I had a follow-up, it would be, and where are they? If in this scenario, the truth is compelled, like he has to tell the truth, right? I think that is the question that I'd want to know, because I think everybody would like to know that. It would help target police efforts. And if I got to ask it first and he answered it truthfully first, maybe that influences what you would ask for after that.
I was just going to say that hopefully you would ask first, because then I don't have to ask that. Because if you ask first, my question would be, were you ever going to stop? Because he talks about, and we mentioned it, I believe it was the last episode, the grand plan.
Yeah.
And he had ideas, he had visions, he had hopes for what he wanted his criminal life to look like. And I think my question would have been, were you ever going to stop? So the next question we have is from
YouTube. Thank you for watching on YouTube.
Yeah, it's Chris DZ4VH. Another fantastic episode, you guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Curious to know why, for a non-empath, why Keyes' daughter was so important to him. Do you think, as a narcissist, he saw her as a proxy extension of his wondrous self? Thank you.
It's a good question.
It is a good question. And, he did talk about his daughter some in these interview tapes. I suppose that's possible. He did seem to have, in his words anyway, whether it was actually true or whether he felt this way, there was an element of a protective shell that he wanted to build, or he said he wanted to build around his family, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, what he said, what he meant, two different things often. So, yeah, it's a good question, and I think worth considering.
Yeah, did he have a code? Maybe. He seemed to put himself out there like that. But one of the things that seemed to genuinely be true is that he, by all appearances, outwardly, like the family part of him he was actually a good and caring father. Seems to be the characterization. How much of that was a front, we don't know. I am intrigued by the possibility that her as a reflection of him made him not want to harm her, because he was very concerned about protecting her after he was captured.
Yeah.
Interesting. Let's do some comments. These are from YouTube. These are from reviews. So if you are...
YouTube comments are my favorite comments.
Yes. From Apple Reviews, Spotify, YouTube. If you're listening on any of those platforms, feel free to leave us a comment or a question, and we'll handle them. We'll handle some of them in these off-script episodes.
And we jump in there too. And comment back.
Yes.
So we're engaged in that process.
First comment comes from Fiona True Crime Vamp. If he had not gone with the whole ransom thing, he probably would have gotten away with it. Well, for much longer anyway. I totally agree.
Couldn't agree more.
Keyes would agree too. I believe he said on tape that, he just kept chasing higher highs and more adrenaline, and the ransom thing, he knows it. He knows it.
And then AU Jax 1 says, I'm reading the book American Predator. He got extremely sloppy in the Koenig case. It's also mind-boggling that he did not know that ATM cards could be traced. Common sense or a simple Google search would have shown him that they could be traced, since they're all linked to computers. Guy was not as bright as he thought he was.
I find it mind-boggling too, and I don't know if I believe it.
Yeah, believe what?
That he didn't know that ATM cards could be traced.
Yeah, I don't know if I believe it either, because I do think he was smart, but the idea that at the end of the day, what got him caught was something as simple as using the debit card.
Yeah, he was so meticulous about every detail and knowing all this stuff, the ins and outs, and how cameras worked. And, I just find it hard to believe that he didn't know that ATM cards could be traced.
But if he was in the midst of losing control, as he said, that's when you get sloppy, right?
My personal opinion, based on just kind of living with this guy for a few months now, is that he knew that ATM cards could be traced, and that was part of the high, right? He wanted to be chased. He wanted to have that cat and mouse game. I think he knew it. I don't know why he wouldn't admit it, but yeah, I find it mind-boggling too that he wouldn't. But from @Lols6449, thank you for commenting. Can you make more parts to this, please? This case is so unique. It's fascinating for so many reasons. For me, the case is intriguing because it forces a mirror to us as humans. There is something so primitive and primal about the way he operated. He lived in another world from the rest of the human race. As though while the rest of us have largely evolved to a higher level of thinking and being, he is a remnant of the brutality of the humans of prehistory. Yeah, and thank you for the comment. Far fewer consequences in prehistory, in less evolved societies, for sure.
Yeah, and to answer your question of whether we can make more parts of this, we could, but at some point we have to move on to another story. I will take this moment to tell you there is a show out there called True Crime Bullshit, which has covered the Israel Keyes case extensively and is much more dense and much more compact with study. And if you're looking for more, that would be a fantastic place to start. The next comment is from GB3256. Candy bars for a serial killer. That's a sentence I never thought I'd hear in my whole life.
Same.
I get it, but I never thought I'd hear it. Yeah.
Jeff Bell would agree. Yeah.
Same here. This is what you call trying to establish a dynamic and a rapport and a rhythm with somebody, right? You kind of have to meet them where you can meet them. And so if that meant getting him a candy bar, meant getting him a candy bar.
And for our final comment, and then we're going to tell you what the next story that we're going to be tackling is, our next Deviant. This comes from spaghetti.lee-69. Keyes is the most fascinating serial killer in modern time. I went down the rabbit hole a year ago and was fixated. The interrogations, his interviews, they're chilling. This guy knew his shit. Calculating, random victimology, sexual deviancy, unbelievable. Thank you for working on this. Instant sub. Thank you for subscribing, and thank you for the kind words. Yeah, he's a compelling guy, right? Evil. I believe in evil. I believe the monsters are real. And to me, Israel Keyes is example A of that.
That comment sounds to me almost verbatim when I said to you, hey, have you heard of Israel Keyes? And you said no. And I basically was like, he's fascinating. The interrogations, the interviews, I've gone down this rabbit hole. And it's unbelievable that someone like this operated largely in plain sight, but managed to do his due diligence to stay out of view. I mean, he was just, it's unprecedented, really.
In fairness to me, I had heard of Israel Keyes. I just, didn't know much about him.
I think you said something like, give me the debrief. Give me the debrief.
Like, oh, buddy. Way, buddy.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, thank you for submitting your questions and comments. Again, as we go, please leave them wherever you follow this podcast on the platform of your choosing, where it's allowed. Please check out our Patreon at deviantpodcast.com, and there you can leave comments and chat with us directly at the Deviant Black tier, and leave comments on YouTube as well. Keep them coming. Thanks a lot. And now,
our next story. So before we get to that, I just want to underscore a couple things. We're going to be expanding the Deviant concept beyond just serial killers, right? We're going to be trying to explore a lot of things that fall under that umbrella. But before we leave the realm of kind of the, a character analysis or a story analysis of one person responsible for multiple murders, the next story we're going to jump into is a gentleman by the name of Anthony Sowell, who in 2009 was arrested and brought into the Cleveland, Ohio Police Department. And inside his home, police found 11 victims, 11 bodies, 11 women who he had killed over the course of a period of time. And one of the things that's interesting about Anthony Sowell is that in a lot of ways, the Anthony Sowell case is everything that Keyes is not. Keyes was a guy that crisscrossed the country, kill kits, meticulous, victims from all over the place. And Anthony Sowell is completely the opposite. This is a guy that operated virtually within a 8-10 block radius of his own home in Cleveland. And these victims were very much kind of in the moment, right? The calculation wasn't necessarily there like it was with Keyes.
And because of who the victims were, they were sort of in a high-risk lifestyle. Many of them had substance abuse problems, and he lived in the neighborhood where they lived. And he found them to be, for lack of a better term, easy prey. And it's quite surprising that he would uncaught for so long, because one of the interesting wrinkles of this story is that there was a horrible smell permeating this neighborhood in Cleveland, and everyone blamed this one sausage factory that was next to Sowell's house. And it wasn't until a man was walking by Sowell's house and a woman came flying out the second-story window in an attempt to escape that Sowell was eventually caught. It took police a week to walk into that house, but that's a part of the story as well. But it's a hell of a story.
In addition to kind of the criminal element of investigating and trying to figure out what made this guy's brain operate the way it did, there's an entire other level that I think is really interesting that we're going to delve into, which is, were there warning signs missed? Were there red flags missed? What was the role of the police department in the process of investigating this man? He had a record. He was in the system. What were the pieces in place or were not in place that protected these women? Because there's 11 bodies. There's also at least 4 victims who survived multiple interactions with him. And so there's a whole other layer to the story that is incredibly interesting to kind of delve into. And we're going to do that over the course of,
Yeah, and just like with Keys, we talked to a lot of people to really get our arms around this story and this person and the people in community that were impacted. One of those people was Zach Reed, who's the former Cleveland City Council member, and he represented the district in which Sewell operated. And here's a little bit about what he had to say from that time.
I now know what a dead body smells like because it never comes out of your stench. That stench never leaves you. So she must have knew what a dead body was because she was the one who said there's a foul smell in the neighborhood and it smells like a dead body. And then we went back, we looked at the phone records that we had, we showed it to the police, we showed it to everybody, and it was clear. She was absolutely right years beforehand that dead body smell was right there, and he was burying those bodies right there. So that whole thing, who knows how many people could have been saved if we would have just done some better police work than we did.
So that's really one of the central core themes of this story is how many people could have been saved if there had been different work done on this case. One of the other people we talked to was a gentleman by the name of Don Laster, and we'll save kind of his whole story for the show. But he is a witness in this case in a number of ways. And I want you to hear this piece of sound, which basically is when he learns that Anthony Sewell had been identified as the man responsible for what was going on. Take a listen.
Let me tell you about looking into his eyes. I looked into his eyes. He had these little beanie eyes, and I couldn't see nothing. It looked like he was staring straight through me every time I ever looked at him. It was something about him, but I just couldn't put my hand on it. But if I ever see that look again, I know who that person is. That was evil, demon, devil, Anthony Sewell.
And that's the story we'll be telling in our next series of Deviant, which begins 1 week from when this show drops. So if you're listening to this now, it's this upcoming Tuesday. And if you're listening to this later, go back and find it because it'll be on your feed.
This has been fun doing the off-script episode.
Yep.
And kind of breaking form, stepping outside of our kind of normal storytelling mode. So let us know in the comments and on social, all those places, obviously we're around, so you can still hit us up and ask us things about Keys.
And where can they find us on social, Andrew?
At deviant.podcast.
On which platforms?
On TikTok and on Instagram.
That's right.
I feel like you're quizzing me.
And you passed.
Thanks for being with us. We really appreciate you guys downloading this week and every week, and enjoyed it. We hope you'll join us next week for the new story.
Yeah, and please tell your friends to check out the show. And again, check out our Patreon at deviantpodcast.com. Deviant is written, produced, and executive produced by Clark Goldband, Andrew Iden, and me, Dan Szematowicz. Editorial and production consultation comes from Jenny Ament. Original scoring comes from Shuvo Sir. Marketing, sales, and distribution support come from our friends at Gemini 13. Deviant is a production of what, Drew?
Cold Open Media.
That's right. Thanks for listening.